You're standing in the marble-floored entrance of the Dakota apartment building on Manhattan's Upper West Side. The doorman, dressed in full livery that cost more than most Americans earned in a year, nods as you pass. You step into a private elevator with mahogany paneling and mirrors framed in gold leaf. As the brass cage rises, you hear the faint sound of a Steinway grand piano drifting from someone's salon 7 floors above. You're about to enter an apartment that spans an entire floor, contains 14 rooms, and has running water in multiple bathrooms, a luxury so rare that most New Yorkers still rely on communal pumps and outhouses. But here's what nobody tells you about these gilded palaces in the sky. They were never meant to exist at all. The very concept of wealthy Americans living in apartments was considered not just unusual, but downright scandalous. For generations, the elite viewed apartment living as something only Europeans did, and not even respectable Europeans at that. American high society believed that sharing a building with other families, no matter how luxurious, was fundamentally beneath their dignity. A proper family of means lived in a private mansion, employed a full household staff, and would sooner lose their fortune than share an address with another soul. Yet, within a single generation, some of the most prominent names in American society, Vanderbilts, Astors, Rockefellers, would not only accept apartment living, but transform it into the ultimate symbol of sophisticated, urban luxury. What changed their minds reveals everything about how the Gilded Age elite truly lived, and what you discover about their private lives behind those limestone facades will fundamentally alter how you see American wealth and power. The story begins in 1869, when a developer named Rutherford Stuyvesant made a decision that New York society declared social suicide. He announced plans to build a luxury apartment building on East 18th Street. Not tenements for the working poor, those existed throughout the city, but elegant apartments specifically designed for wealthy families. His own family, the Stuyvesants, were descended from Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch Director General of New Amsterdam. They were old money, proper society, the kind of people who defined what was acceptable in New York social circles. And they were horrified. Stuyvesant's relatives reportedly refused to speak to him. Society matrons crossed the street rather than acknowledge him. The newspapers printed editorials questioning his sanity and his judgment. One prominent critic declared that people of breeding will never consent to live on mere shelves under a common roof. But Rutherford Stuyvesant understood something that old New York society refused to see. The city was changing, dramatically. In 1860, Manhattan's population was just over 800,000. By 1870, it had soared past 1 million. By 1880, it would reach 1.2 million. The city was bursting at its seams, expanding northward at a pace that left even the wealthy struggling to maintain their traditional lifestyle. Those grand townhouses on Fifth Avenue required massive staffs, sometimes 20 or 30 servants for a single family. Finding, housing, managing, and retaining quality household staff was becoming increasingly difficult as the city's economy offered working-class people more options than domestic service. The cost of maintaining a private urban mansion was escalating dramatically. Property values were rising, taxes were increasing, and a new generation of millionaires was flooding into New York, making the old distinctions between who belonged and who didn't increasingly difficult to maintain. Stuyvesant designed his building, which he called the Stuyvesant Apartments, to address every objection that high society might raise. Each apartment occupied an entire floor, ensuring privacy. The building featured innovative amenities that even the finest townhouses couldn't match. Steam heat distributed through pipes to every room, gas lighting, speaking tubes connecting different floors, and something truly revolutionary: dumbwaiters that could carry meals from a central kitchen up to individual apartments. The building had a restaurant on the ground floor, run by a French chef, a laundry service in the basement, and uniformed staff attending to every need. Stuyvesant's pitch was simple. Why maintain an entire household staff when you could have all the services of a luxury hotel combined with the privacy of a private home? New York society responded with icy silence. The Stuyvesant Apartments opened in 1869 with exactly 0 socially prominent tenants. Rutherford Stuyvesant had built his vision, and nobody came. For months, the building stood as a testament to what society deemed a spectacular failure of judgment. Then something unexpected happened. A few families, not the most prominent but respectable nonetheless, moved in. They were largely young couples, professionals, people who appreciated luxury but couldn't quite afford the full expense of a proper townhouse. They discovered something remarkable. Apartment living wasn't just acceptable. It was extraordinarily comfortable. More comfortable, in many ways, than rattling around a 4-story townhouse with a staff you couldn't quite afford to pay properly. The wives talked. They mentioned to friends at their clubs and church gatherings that they didn't have to manage a large household staff. They didn't have to oversee a coal delivery and worry about fires in the basement furnace. They didn't have to maintain a carriage house and stable. Their husbands mentioned to business associates that the cost savings were substantial and the convenience remarkable. Within 2 years, the Stuyvesant apartments were fully occupied, and Rutherford Stuyvesant began planning a second building. The revolution had begun, though proper societies still pretended not to notice. The real transformation came in 1884 with the completion of the Dakota. And if you think what you've heard so far is fascinating, wait until you understand what the Dakota represented and what really happened inside those walls. The Dakota's developer, Edward Clark, was the heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune. He was already wealthy beyond imagination when he decided to build the most luxurious apartment building America had ever seen. But Clark wasn't just building an apartment house. He was making a calculated bet that would either cement his place in history or become the most expensive folly ever constructed in New York. He chose a location so far north and so far west that it was practically in the wilderness, hence the name Dakota, suggesting it might as well be in the Dakota Territory. In 1880, when construction began, the area around 72nd Street and Central Park West was occupied by squatters' shanties, roaming pigs, and not much else. Proper society lived 30 blocks south. Everyone said Clark was insane. His architect, Henry Hardenberg, designed something that looked less like an apartment building and more like a Renaissance chateau that had somehow been transported from the Loire Valley and enlarged to massive proportions. The building covered an entire city block. It rose 8, 9, and 10 stories in different sections, with towers and gables and dormers creating a dramatic roofline that looked like something from a fairy tale. The exterior featured warm yellow brick and elaborate terracotta ornamentation. A massive arched entrance led to an interior courtyard large enough to turn a carriage around. The building contained 65 apartments, and no two were exactly alike. But here's what made the Dakota genuinely revolutionary. Clark designed it with luxury that exceeded most private mansions. Every apartment had multiple bathrooms, unheard of in an era when even wealthy families often shared a single bathroom. The building had 4 elevators, each large enough to accommodate a grand piano. The walls between apartments were extraordinarily thick, up to 3 feet in some places, ensuring that you would never hear your neighbors. Each apartment had 14-foot ceilings, parquet floors, mahogany woodwork, and marble fireplaces. The kitchens featured running hot and cold water, gas ranges, and built-in ice boxes. There were servants' rooms and back staircases, ensuring that staff could move through the building invisibly, never crossing paths with residents. The Dakota had its own power plant, generating electricity for lighting years before most of New York had electrical service. It had a wine cellar with private storage rooms for each apartment, a laundry in the basement with the latest equipment, and a massive water storage system that ensured consistent water pressure even on the highest floors. The apartments themselves ranged from 4 rooms to 20 rooms. The largest apartments were breathtaking. Imagine walking through a formal entrance gallery with walls covered in damask silk wallpaper. You pass into a drawing room 40 feet long with windows overlooking Central Park. The room features elaborate plasterwork on the ceiling, a massive chandelier, and a marble fireplace so large you could stand inside it. Through pocket doors, you enter a formal dining room that seats 24 comfortably. Beyond that, a library with floor-to-ceiling built-in bookcases, a music room with perfect acoustics, a morning room, a conservatory with a glass ceiling for the ladies' plants. 5 or 6 bedrooms, each with its own bathroom. Something so luxurious that visitors literally gasped. A kitchen large enough to employ a full culinary staff. Servants' quarters that would themselves be considered spacious by most standards. And throughout, details that demonstrated Clark's obsessive attention to quality. Solid bronze doorknobs, hand-carved wooden mantels, parquet floors in intricate patterns, mahogany-paneled walls, stained glass windows in the stairwells. When the Dakota opened in 1884, Edward Clark faced the same problem Ruthersworth Stuyvesant had encountered 15 years earlier. How do you convince society that apartment living is acceptable? Clark's solution was brilliantly simple. He moved in himself. The building's creator, an enormously wealthy man who could have built himself any mansion in New York, chose to live in an apartment in his own building. The statement was impossible to ignore. If Edward Clark, singer sewing machine heir, member of the Union Club, married into old New York society, thought apartment living was appropriate, perhaps society needed to reconsider its prejudices. Clark didn't live to see his gamble pay off. He died just 4 months after the Dakota opened, but pay off it did. Gradually, then rapidly, the Dakota filled with tenants whose names read like a who's who of New York society. Successful merchants, prominent lawyers, a former U.S. Postmaster General. The families weren't quite the absolute cream of society. The Astors and Vanderbilts still maintained their Fifth Avenue mansions, but they were substantial, respectable, wealthy. And they were remarkably happy. Because here's what the Dakota offered that even the finest mansion couldn't match. Effortless luxury. Think about what it meant to maintain a private mansion in 1880s New York. You needed a butler to manage the household and interact with visitors, a housekeeper to supervise the female staff, a cook, and likely several kitchen maids, parlor maids to maintain the public rooms, a lady's maid for the mistress of the house, a valet for the master, chambermaids for the bedrooms, laundresses, a coachman and stable hands if you kept a carriage, potentially a gardener if you had a yard of any size. For a substantial household, you might employ 20 people. You had to house them, feed them, manage their schedules, resolve their conflicts, ensure their work met your standards. It was, in effect, running a small business while also trying to maintain your social position, raise your children, and participate in society. The Dakota made all of that vastly simpler. The building employed its own superintendent and staff, who handled maintenance, repairs, cleaning of common areas, and coordination of deliveries. There was a central laundry where your household linens could be professionally cleaned. You could employ your own cook or use the building's catering service. You needed perhaps a quarter of the household staff you'd require in a private home. Your costs were lower, your management burden was lighter, and you lived in luxury that most mansion owners envied. If you're enjoying this journey into the hidden world of Gilded Age luxury, make sure you subscribe, because what we discover about the secret scandals and shocking behaviors behind these elegant facades gets far more fascinating than you might imagine. As the Dakota proved successful, developers across Manhattan took notice. But they didn't just copy what Clark had done. They tried to exceed it. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, luxury apartment buildings sprouted along Central Park West, then spread to Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue, and the side streets of the Upper East Side. Each developer tried to outdo the others with increasingly extravagant amenities and architectural flourishes. The result was an apartment building boom that transformed New York's residential landscape and created some of the most spectacular living spaces America had ever seen. The Osborne, completed in 1885 on West 57th Street, featured apartments with 20-foot ceilings, private art galleries, and ballrooms large enough for society parties. The building's architect, James Edward Ware, designed it in the Italian Renaissance palazzo style with a facade covered in elaborate carved stone ornamentation. The Osborne's developer specifically marketed to artists and musicians, recognizing that this group, wealthy but often not society in the traditional sense, would appreciate both the luxury and the creative freedom apartment living offered. The building attracted prominent portrait painters, opera singers, and composers who transformed their apartments into showcases for their artistic sensibilities. But here's what made the Osborne truly notable. It demonstrated that apartment living could offer something private homes couldn't: community. The building's residents formed an artistic salon, gathering regularly in each other's apartments for musical performances, poetry readings, and art exhibitions. The wives organized charity events together. The husbands collaborated on business ventures. A social ecosystem developed within the building that enriched residents' lives in ways that isolated mansion living never could. This sense of community would become one of apartment living's unexpected benefits, though society ladies would never admit it publicly. The Ansonia, which opened in 1904 on Broadway between 73rd and 74th Streets, took luxury to levels that seemed almost absurd. The building's developer, William Earl Dodge Stokes, was the heir to a copper mining and railroad fortune and had ideas about apartment living that bordered on the megalomaniacal. He wanted to build not just an apartment house, but a complete, self-contained luxury community. The result was a massive Beaux-Arts structure that covered an entire city block and contained 340 apartments, ranging in size from 4 rooms to 20 rooms. The building featured 2 grand entrances, each leading to lobbies decorated with marble, mirrors, and elaborate metalwork. There were ballrooms, a restaurant, a cafe, meeting rooms, and a shopping arcade with space for stores. The Ansonia had a Turkish bath in the basement, a full spa with steam rooms, massage rooms, and a swimming pool. On the roof, Stokes installed a working farm with chickens, ducks, and goats, providing fresh eggs and milk for residents. There was a rooftop garden where residents could stroll. The building had its own power plant, ice-making facility, and water filtration system. But the Ansonia's most distinctive feature was its soundproofing. Stokes designed it specifically to attract musicians, opera singers, and performers. The walls between apartments were built with air gaps and thick masonry, creating almost perfect sound isolation. The result was that residents could practice instruments or sing at full voice without disturbing their neighbors. The building became legendary in New York's musical community. Enrico Caruso lived there. Arturo Toscanini, Igor Stravinsky, Lily Pons. The list of famous musicians who called the Ansonia home reads like a catalog of early 20th century musical achievement. Residents would hear Toscanini conducting rehearsals in his apartment, Caruso warming up his voice, young Yehudi Menuhin practicing his violin. The building wasn't just housing, it was a living, breathing center of New York's cultural life. And yet, despite all these amenities, despite the luxury and convenience, the truly wealthy, the absolute pinnacle of New York society, still largely resisted apartment living. The Vanderbilts remained in their Fifth Avenue mansions. The Astors stayed put. The old guard maintained that nothing could match the privacy and prestige of a private home. Until the Alva Vanderbilt scandal changed everything. And trust me, what happens next reveals secrets about elite society that they never wanted you to know. In 1895, Alva Vanderbilt, one of the most prominent and powerful women in New York society, shocked everyone by divorcing her husband, William Kissam Vanderbilt. Divorce among the elite was scandalous enough. But Alva didn't retreat into quiet obscurity as convention demanded. She threw herself into social activism, championing women's suffrage and architectural preservation. Then in 1896, she remarried to Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, another society figure. The couple needed a New York residence, and Alva made a decision that sent shockwaves through high society. They moved into an apartment. Not a modest apartment in some respectable but quiet building. They took a massive floor-through apartment in the newly built Hotel Renaissance on West 43rd Street, and Alva proceeded to decorate it with a level of luxury that rivaled any Fifth Avenue mansion. Alva understood that society's resistance to apartments wasn't really about space or comfort. It was about perception. If she could demonstrate that apartment living was compatible with the highest levels of social prestige, she could demolish the remaining prejudices. Her apartment featured ballrooms, where she hosted some of New York's most exclusive social events. The dining room seated 40 guests comfortably. She had a private art gallery displaying works by old masters. Her drawing room featured 18th century French furniture that would have been at home in Versailles. She proved definitively that you could maintain your social position while living in an apartment. if the apartment was spectacular enough. Alva's embrace of apartment living gave permission to others in her social circle. Within 5 years, several prominent society families had moved into luxury apartments, and developers were building ever more opulent buildings to accommodate them. The early 1900s saw the construction of what historians now call the Golden Age of New York apartment houses. Buildings so grand, so luxurious, so meticulously designed that they set standards for urban residential architecture that have never been matched. 898 Park Avenue, built in 1915, represented the absolute pinnacle of this trend. The building contained just 8 apartments, 1 per floor, and each occupied approximately 3,600 square feet. Every apartment featured formal entrance galleries, drawing rooms, libraries, dining rooms that seated at least 16, 5 or 6 bedrooms, and servants' quarters. The building's design prioritized privacy to an almost extreme degree. The main elevator opened directly into each apartment's private entrance gallery. You never shared elevator space with other residents. There was a separate service elevator for deliveries and staff. The front entrance had a discreet porte cochere, where carriages and later automobiles could pull up, allowing residents to enter and exit the building completely sheltered from weather and public view. The building superintendent screened all visitors, ensuring that unwanted callers never made it past the ground floor. Living at 898 Park Avenue was like having your own private mansion, except with a staff you didn't have to manage and maintenance you didn't have to worry about. But here's what's really fascinating about these luxury apartments: what happened inside them. Because the public face of Gilded Age high society, all those formal balls and elaborate etiquette and rigid social rules, was very different from private reality. And the transition to apartment living revealed behaviors and attitudes that the elite had always kept carefully hidden. For one thing, apartment living was far more casual than mansion living. In a townhouse, different floors served different purposes and required formal transitions. You dressed for dinner. You maintained formal standards in the public rooms. Your private spaces were genuinely private, tucked away on upper floors where even household staff rarely ventured. But in an apartment, everything was on one floor. The spatial divisions were less rigid, and gradually the behavioral standards loosened. Families began dining more casually. They entertained more informally. The strict protocols about dress and behavior that governed mansion life began to feel unnecessarily stuffy in apartment spaces. This casualization horrified old-guard society figures, who saw it as evidence that apartment living was indeed corrupting proper standards. But for many elite families, especially younger couples, it felt like liberation. They could live luxuriously without the performative aspects of mansion life. They could have friends over for dinner without treating it like a state occasion. They could, in short, be a bit more human and a bit less like museum pieces on display. The servants noticed this shift too, and their observations provide some of our most revealing insights into elite behavior. Domestic workers who had served in both townhouses and luxury apartments consistently reported that apartment families were easier to work for. They were more approachable, less formal, more willing to accept minor imperfections. One former butler, interviewed in the 1920s, explained it this way: "In a big house, the family is always aware that they're living in a showcase. They're performing, even for the servants. In an apartment, even a very grand apartment, there's a sense that they're just living. It makes them more pleasant." But apartment living also enabled behaviors that proper society would never have tolerated openly. The privacy that luxury apartments offered, thick walls, discreet staff, neighbors who minded their own business, created space for secrets. Affairs became easier to conduct. A married woman could entertain a gentleman caller in the afternoon with less risk of scandal than in a townhouse with multiple servants who might gossip. Drinking increased. Prohibition in the 1920s was openly flouted in many luxury buildings where doormen could screen police and bootleggers could make deliveries disguised as legitimate tradesmen. Gambling parties became common in apartments in ways they never had been in private homes. The very features that made apartments comfortable, privacy, discretion, professional staff loyal to the building rather than to individual families, also made them venues for behavior that contradicted high society's public values. And then there were the truly scandalous stories, like the incident at the Ansonia in 1908, when a prominent banker's wife was discovered to be running an illegal gambling salon from her apartment twice a week. She'd been hosting high-stakes card games, with players including some of New York's most prominent businessmen. The operation only came to light when one player lost $50,000 in a single night, and threatened to expose the operation unless he was allowed to win back his losses. The banker's wife paid him off, but rumors circulated for years. Or the Dakota resident in the 1890s who kept his mistress in an apartment 3 floors below his family's residence. His wife knew, everyone knew, but the situation could never be openly acknowledged because that would have required admitting that such behavior occurred in their refined building. The mistress lived there for 15 years, supported by the gentleman, occasionally glimpsed in the lobbies and hallways, but never directly addressed or acknowledged by other residents. The whole arrangement was possible only because apartment living allowed for a level of anonymous proximity that mansion living never could. If these revelations are surprising you, you definitely want to stay subscribed, because the secrets of how these families really lived behind closed doors get even more shocking. The transition to apartment living also transformed how wealthy families thought about material possessions and display. In a mansion, you had room for everything. Enormous furniture collections, vast libraries, complete sets of china and crystal for different occasions, wardrobes large enough to walk into. Apartments, even luxury apartments, imposed some limits. You couldn't fit a ballroom that held 300 people into an apartment, no matter how large. You couldn't maintain a stable of horses or a full-scale art gallery. This forced a degree of curation that mansion living never required. You had to choose your most important possessions, your favorite pieces, your most meaningful collections. And something interesting happened. Many families discovered they preferred this edited version of luxury. Less stuff meant less maintenance, less insurance, less worry about theft or damage. A smaller but carefully chosen collection of art meant each piece received more attention and appreciation. A dining table that seated 16 rather than 40 meant dinner parties felt intimate rather than overwhelming. The constraint of space actually improved many families' quality of life by forcing them to focus on what truly mattered to them, rather than simply accumulating everything they could afford. This shift became especially pronounced after World War I. The war had disrupted old social hierarchies and economic patterns. Many of the great fortunes had been divided among multiple heirs. Income taxes, introduced permanently in 1913, made it harder to maintain enormous single-family wealth. The servant problem became acute. Young men and women who before the war might have gone into domestic service now had opportunities in factories, offices, and retail. Finding good household help became difficult and expensive. In this changed environment, luxury apartments made increasing sense even to families who could have afforded private homes. You could live very well, maintain your social position, and do it all with far less hassle and expense than maintaining a mansion required. By the 1920s, apartment living had become not just acceptable, but actually fashionable among even the most elite New Yorkers. Buildings like 740 Park Avenue, completed in 1930, represented the ultimate evolution of the luxury apartment concept. The building was designed by the prestigious architectural firm of Rosario Candela and Arthur Loomis Harmon, specifically for the absolute pinnacle of New York society. It contained just 31 apartments, many occupying entire floors or even multiple floors. The building's roster of residents over the decades reads like a list of the most powerful people in America. John D. Rockefeller Jr., David Rockefeller, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis before she married JFK, Saul Steinberg, Ronald Lauder, Henry Kravis, Stephen Schwartzman. These weren't people who lived in apartments because they couldn't afford mansions. They were people who chose apartments because they offered the best possible urban living experience. But here's what's fascinating about 740 Park Avenue and buildings like it. They weren't just housing. They were power centers. The social connections formed in these buildings translated into business deals, political influence, and cultural authority. When you lived in a building with a dozen of the most influential people in New York, your casual conversations in the lobby or at building social events could shape the direction of American business and politics. Residents of 740 Park Avenue negotiated corporate mergers in each other's drawing rooms. They plotted political strategies while their wives played bridge. They made decisions about charitable giving and arts patronage that shaped American culture. The buildings became, in effect, exclusive clubs where membership was determined by wealth, social position, and the board's approval. That board approval process is itself revealing. By the 1920s, luxury apartment buildings had developed cooperative ownership structures where residents collectively owned the building through a corporation, and the board had to approve new residents. This gave current residents enormous power to control who could join their community. The approval process was often brutal. Applicants had to submit detailed financial information, proving they could afford not just the apartment purchase price, but the ongoing maintenance costs. They had to provide social references from other residents or prominent people in similar social positions. They had to interview with the board, facing questions about their background, their family, their plans for entertaining, even their attitudes toward appropriate building behavior. The process was designed to ensure that new residents would fit with existing residents, a standard that allowed boards to discriminate based on religion, ethnicity, and race, while claiming they were simply maintaining building standards. Jewish families were routinely rejected from buildings dominated by Protestant families. Catholic families faced similar barriers. African Americans were simply excluded entirely, regardless of wealth or social position. The luxury apartment buildings of the 1920s through 1960s were bastions of social exclusivity that reinforced the existing hierarchies of American society. This discrimination was rarely discussed openly, but was universally understood. Prospective residents knew which buildings would consider their applications and which wouldn't. Real estate brokers steered clients to appropriate buildings based on their background. The whole system maintained social divisions that public institutions could no longer legally enforce, and it continued well into the modern era. Buildings like 740 Park Avenue didn't seriously begin admitting Jewish residents until the 1970s, and racial integration came even later. But within these exclusive enclaves, life could be extraordinarily comfortable. Let's talk about what daily life actually looked like in a luxury Gilded Age apartment, because the details reveal just how different this world was from anything most Americans experienced. Imagine you're a wealthy New Yorker living in a top-tier apartment building in 1920. Your apartment occupies an entire floor of a building on Park Avenue. You wake in your bedroom, which features silk wallpaper, a carved mahogany bed, and an ensuite bathroom with marble floors and a porcelain tub large enough for 2 people. Your lady's maid has already been in to open the curtains and lay out your morning clothes. You bathe and dress, then proceed to the breakfast room where your husband is already reading the newspaper. Your cook has prepared breakfast, perhaps eggs, bacon, toast, fresh fruit, coffee, which your parlor maid serves. You discuss the day's plans. Your husband will go to his office downtown. You have a meeting of your women's club at 11, lunch with friends at 1, and a fitting at your dressmaker at 3. After breakfast, you proceed to your morning room, a sunny space with large windows and comfortable furniture where you handle correspondence and household management. Your secretary arrives at 9:30 with the day's mail. There are invitations to upcoming social events that require responses, bills to approve for payment, a letter from your mother in Boston that you will answer by hand. Your housekeeper appears to discuss the week's menus and coordinate with the building's laundry service about your linens. Your lady's maid confirms your afternoon appointments and ensures your car and driver will be ready. By 10:30, you're ready to leave for your club meeting. You take the elevator down to the lobby, the same elevator you always use, which opens directly into your apartment's entrance gallery. The building's doorman has already summoned your car, and your driver is waiting at the curb. You arrive at your club for the meeting, which goes until 12:30. Your friends invite you to join them for lunch at the Colony Club, and you agree. After lunch, you proceed to your dressmaker for your fitting. You're having an evening gown made for an upcoming charity ball, pale blue silk with elaborate beading and a train. The fitting takes an hour. You return home around 4:30. The afternoon hours are quiet. You might read, write letters, or receive friends who drop by for tea. Around 6, your husband returns home. You both change for dinner, he into evening clothes, you into a dinner dress. You dine at 8 in your formal dining room. Your cook has prepared multiple courses: soup, fish, a roast, salad, dessert, coffee. Your parlor maid serves while your butler manages the wine. After dinner, you might attend a concert or the theater, or you might simply spend a quiet evening at home, reading or listening to your Victrola. You retire around 11, and your lady's maid helps you undress and prepare for bed. This daily rhythm, leisurely, comfortable, attended at every moment by staff who handle practical details, was possible because of how luxury apartments were designed and operated. You never had to think about mundane concerns. The building's staff handled mail delivery, package receipt, and coordination with vendors. The building superintendent managed all maintenance and repairs. Building staff cleaned common areas, maintained the elevators, and ensured heating and lighting systems functioned properly. Within your apartment, your household staff handled cooking, cleaning, laundry, and personal service. You lived in a bubble of comfort where your primary concerns were social obligations, charitable work, and personal enjoyment. The expense of maintaining this lifestyle was enormous, but it was far less than maintaining a comparable private mansion. A family living in a luxury Park Avenue apartment in 1920 might spend $25,000 per year on household expenses, about $400,000 in today's money. That included staff salaries, building maintenance charges, food, entertainment, and incidentals. A comparable mansion would cost twice that much or more when you factored in property taxes, insurance, maintenance, larger household staff, and utilities. The apartment lifestyle offered luxury at a relative bargain. And here's what might surprise you most: what that luxury really meant for the women of these households. Because while we think of the Gilded Age as a time when wealthy women lived idle, ornamental lives, the reality was far more complex. Managing a luxury household, whether in a mansion or an apartment, was serious work that required genuine skill and constant attention. Even with a full household staff, the lady of the house was ultimately responsible for ensuring everything ran smoothly. She hired and fired staff. She planned menus and approved expenses. She coordinated the social calendar and managed relationships with other society families. She organized charitable work and cultural activities. She oversaw her children's education and upbringing. The work was often invisible. Successful household management meant that everything appeared effortless, but it was demanding and constant. Apartment living changed the nature of this work in interesting ways. With building staff handling many maintenance issues, women had somewhat less to manage in terms of pure logistics. But they often invested that freed up time in more elaborate social activities. The competition for social prestige among elite families was fierce, and apartment living actually intensified it in some ways. When everyone lived in mansions spread across the city, your home's size and location served as obvious markers of your status. When everyone lived in luxury apartments in the same few neighborhoods, status competition shifted to more subtle markers. The quality of your entertaining, the exclusivity of your guest lists, the elegance of your dress and jewels, your family's charitable giving, and cultural patronage. This competition drove much of the elaborate social ritual that characterized Gilded Age society. The formal calling card system, where women left cards at each other's homes according to complex rules about who could call on whom and when. The intricate etiquette around dinner parties, with strict protocols about seating arrangements, service, and conversation. The elaborate dress codes that required multiple outfit changes per day. All of this served to maintain social hierarchies and demonstrate superior breeding and refinement. And all of it was work that fell primarily to women, who bore the burden of maintaining their family's social position through constant performance of these elaborate rituals. Some women found this exhausting and empty. Others genuinely enjoyed the social competition and the power that came with success in this arena. A society matron who hosted the most sought-after events, whose invitations were most coveted, whose approval could make or break a younger woman's social debut. She wielded real power, even if it was power exercised through tea parties and dinner arrangements rather than boardrooms and political offices. And in the world of luxury apartments, where proximity meant constant social interaction with your neighbors, this power was on display daily. The buildings themselves became stages for this social competition. Buildings like 740 Park Avenue or 834 Fifth Avenue had reputations as the most exclusive addresses, and simply living there conveyed status. Within buildings, residents jockeyed for the most desirable apartments, the ones with the best views, the most rooms, the finest original details. Building social events, holiday parties, charity fundraisers, summer roof garden parties became opportunities to display wealth and refinement. The building board positions were coveted not just because they conveyed authority over building operations, but because they signaled social preeminence among residents. If you're fascinated by these glimpses into how power and prestige really worked in Gilded Age society, make sure you stay until the end, because what I reveal about the secret lives of these families will shock you. But let's talk about the servants, because no account of luxury apartment living is complete without understanding the people who made it all possible. The Gilded Age elite couldn't have maintained their lifestyle without an enormous servant class, and the transition from private homes to apartment buildings transformed the nature of domestic service in important ways. In a private mansion, servants lived in the house, usually in small rooms on the top floor or in a separate servants' wing. They worked long hours, typically 6 days a week, from early morning until late at night. Their lives were completely enmeshed with the family they served. They had little privacy and little freedom. In exchange, they received room and board, a modest salary, and sometimes the reflected prestige of working for a prominent family. The system was hierarchical and often harsh. Upper servants like butlers and housekeepers had authority over lower servants and weren't shy about using it. Family members could be demanding, capricious, and sometimes cruel, and servants had almost no recourse if they were mistreated. Quitting without a reference meant difficulty finding another position. Apartment living changed this system in subtle but important ways. In luxury apartments, some servants still lived in. Each apartment had servants' rooms for essential staff, but many servants became day workers who lived elsewhere and came in for specific shifts. This gave them more independence and more ability to maintain their own lives separate from work. Building staff, doormen, elevator operators, cleaners, maintenance workers, were employed by the building rather than individual families, which meant they had different working conditions and often more stability than family-employed servants. The union movement made stronger inroads among building workers than among traditional household servants. By the 1920s, building staff in many luxury buildings had basic labor protections, reasonable hours, and better wages than servants employed directly by families. But the experience of household servants in luxury apartments varied enormously depending on which family employed them. Some elite families were considerate employers who treated their staff decently, paid fairly, and respected boundaries. Others were nightmares to work for, demanding, arbitrary, sometimes abusive, and servants talked. Within the tight-knit community of domestic workers in elite neighborhoods, reputations spread quickly. Families known for treating servants badly found it increasingly difficult to attract and retain quality staff. This gave servants a degree of power that they'd never had in earlier eras when domestic service was one of the few employment options for working-class women and immigrants. The stories servants told about their employers reveal aspects of elite life that the families themselves carefully concealed. Servants knew which society marriages were shams, maintained only for appearance, while husband and wife barely spoke to each other. They knew which prominent businessmen drank heavily in private, whatever their public temperance advocacy. They knew which society matrons were addicted to opiates prescribed by complacent doctors. They knew which respectable families were teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, maintaining appearances on credit while desperately seeking advantageous marriages for their daughters. They knew which seemingly devoted couples maintained separate bedrooms and separate lives, united only by social convention and financial necessity. One former lady's maid, interviewed in the 1930s about her years serving a prominent Park Avenue family in the 1920s, described her employers this way. In public, they were the perfect couple. Beautiful, charming, always together at society events. In private, they could barely stand to be in the same room. He had a mistress he saw 3 afternoons a week. She had a gentleman friend who visited when her husband was away on business. They put on a show for society, but everyone who worked for them knew the truth. The maid also noted that despite this dysfunctional marriage, or perhaps because of it, both husband and wife were absolutely meticulous about maintaining their social position and public image. Image was everything, especially when the reality behind it was hollow. This gap between public image and private reality was perhaps the defining characteristic of Gilded Age elite society. The elaborate social rituals, the strict etiquette, the obsessive concern with propriety, all of it was performance, a collective fiction that everyone agreed to maintain. You pretended to believe that marriages were romantic partnerships, even when everyone knew they were economic arrangements. You pretended that inherited wealth reflected virtue and ability even when it obviously didn't. You pretended that rigid social hierarchies were natural and proper, even when they were clearly arbitrary and unjust. And you maintained these fictions because your position in society depended on everyone continuing to perform the same elaborate charade. Luxury apartment living both reinforced and undermined these fictions. It reinforced them by creating exclusive enclaves where only the right people could live, thus maintaining physical separation from those deemed socially inferior. But it also undermined them by forcing people into closer proximity with neighbors, making it harder to maintain complete privacy and complete control over your image. In a private mansion, you could wall yourself off almost completely, seeing only people you chose to see. In an apartment building, no matter how exclusive, you shared space with neighbors. You encountered them in lobbies and elevators. Your children played together. Your servants gossiped with their servants. This forced a degree of transparency that made the pretense harder to maintain perfectly. By the 1930s, the Gilded Age was definitively over. The 1929 stock market crash and subsequent Great Depression shattered many of the great fortunes that had sustained luxury apartment living. Families who had lived in massive Park Avenue apartments downsized to smaller spaces or moved out of Manhattan entirely. Buildings that had been purely residential added commercial tenants on lower floors to generate income. The elaborate social rituals that had characterized elite society loosened and eventually collapsed. The economic crisis made such displays seem grotesque when so many Americans were suffering. The servant class that had made the luxury lifestyle possible shrank dramatically as economic pressures and changing social attitudes made domestic service less attractive. But the buildings remain, and many still serve as luxury housing for New York's elite. 740 Park Avenue still ranks among the most prestigious addresses in Manhattan. The Dakota still houses some of New York's most famous residents. The Ansonia, though converted to condominiums, still attracts musicians and artists. These buildings stand as monuments to an era when American inequality reached levels that have only recently been matched, and to a vision of urban luxury that has never been surpassed. Walking past them today, it's easy to see only their beautiful facades and imagine that they were simply elegant homes for wealthy families. But understanding what really happened inside, the social competition, the hidden scandals, the servants who enabled it all, the gap between image and reality, reveals something profound about American society, both then and now. Because here's the thing about the Gilded Age luxury apartment. It was a solution to a problem, and the problem was how to maintain extreme inequality and social hierarchy in an increasingly democratic society. Private mansions had worked when the elite were a tiny fraction of the population, and everyone else was obviously and utterly excluded from their world. But as cities grew, as new fortunes were made, As America became more urban and modern, maintaining that absolute separation became harder. The luxury apartment building was brilliantly adapted to this challenge. It offered exclusivity. Board approval processes ensured only the right people could enter. It offered privacy, thick walls, and professional staff who knew how to be discreet. It offered community. You lived among your social equals, reinforcing shared values and connections. And it offered all of this with less expense and hassle than maintaining a private mansion, making it sustainable even as fortunes were divided among heirs and economic conditions changed. The system wasn't perfect. Cracks appeared from the start. Families who seemed respectable went bankrupt. Marriages that seemed solid fell apart. People who should never have been admitted somehow made it in through connections or persistence. But the system was remarkably resilient, and it maintained its basic structure for decades. Even today, the same buildings that housed Gilded Age millionaires now house modern billionaires. And the same social mechanisms, board approval, financial screening, discretion, exclusivity, still operate. The names have changed, the specific fortunes have changed, but the basic arrangement persists. A luxury enclave where the very wealthy can live among their own kind, insulated from the broader society, while still enjoying the benefits of urban life. Understanding this history matters because it reveals how inequality perpetuates itself, not through force, but through social arrangements that seem natural, comfortable, and even benign. The luxury apartment building isn't a prison or a fortress. It's simply nice housing for people who can afford it. But the cumulative effect of thousands of such buildings, each maintaining its own exclusivity, is to create a parallel society where the wealthy live, work, socialize, and exercise power almost entirely separate from everyone else. They're not isolated in country estates or remote compounds. They're right in the middle of major cities, walking the same streets as everyone else. But they might as well be in a different world, and the luxury apartment building is the mechanism that maintains that separation. The Gilded Age elite understood something that many modern wealthy people have forgotten. Image is crucial, and maintaining it requires constant work. You couldn't just be rich. You had to perform wealth in specific ways that demonstrated you belonged to a particular class. The luxury apartment building was perfectly designed for this performance. Its beautiful facade proclaimed status to everyone who passed by. Its exclusive resident roster ensured you were surrounded by social equals who understood and validated your position. Its careful management maintained standards and prevented anyone who might disrupt the performance from entering. And its internal culture enforced the unwritten rules about behavior, dress, entertaining, and social interaction that marked you as truly elite. This performative aspect of elite life is easy to mock, and many critics did mock it even at the time. But the people living these lives mostly weren't fools. They understood that the performance was necessary because their privileged position had no other foundation. They hadn't earned their wealth through merit. Most had inherited it or married into it. They possessed no special skills or abilities that justified their advantages. Their only claim to superiority was breeding and refinement, and these could only be demonstrated through performance. So they performed elaborately and continuously, because the alternative was admitting that their privileged position was arbitrary and indefensible. The luxury apartment buildings made this performance easier by creating controlled environments where everyone agreed on the rules. You didn't have to constantly police yourself the way you would in a more public setting, because everyone around you shared the same understanding of appropriate behavior. And when someone violated those unwritten rules, entertaining inappropriately, dressing wrongly, behaving in ways that embarrassed other residents, the building's social mechanisms corrected the problem. Other residents might simply stop acknowledging the offender socially, making their life in the building so uncomfortable they chose to leave. The building board might manufacture reasons to force them out. One way or another, the system protected itself. What happened to these families eventually? The story doesn't have a neat ending because it's not really over. Many of the families who lived in luxury Gilded Age apartments, the Rockefellers, the Astors, branches of the Vanderbilts, still exist, still wealthy, still prominent. They've adapted to changing times, moved some of their focus from conspicuous consumption to philanthropy and cultural institutions, but they've retained their wealth and influence across multiple generations. The buildings they lived in have appreciated enormously in value. Apartments in these historic structures now sell for tens of millions of dollars. The social mechanisms they developed, exclusive clubs, careful marriage alliances, educational institutions that credential their children, continue to maintain elite status across generations. Other families lost their fortunes in the Depression, or through bad investments, or through sheer profligacy. The Gilded Age was full of families who seemed secure, but were actually living on credit, maintaining appearances while slowly going broke. When the crash came, they collapsed quickly and completely. Their names, once prominent, faded from society pages and memory. The luxury apartments they'd occupied were taken by new residents, new fortunes, new families, climbing the social ladder. And this points to something important about American elite society. It's simultaneously remarkably stable and remarkably fluid. The same families and institutions remain powerful across centuries. Harvard is still Harvard. The Rockefellers are still wealthy and influential. But there's also constant turnover at the edges, with new fortunes made and old fortunes lost, social positions gained and lost. The luxury apartment building facilitated both stability and turnover. It provided established families a way to maintain their position efficiently, but it also provided ambitious newcomers a path to acceptance. If you could buy your way into the right building and learn to perform wealth properly, you could be absorbed into the elite within a generation or two. This brings us to perhaps the most interesting question about Gilded Age luxury apartments. What did they mean to the people who lived in them? Were residents conscious of the social mechanisms they participated in? Did they understand that their lifestyle was fundamentally about performing and maintaining inequality? Or did they simply experience it as normal, comfortable living? The evidence suggests a range of awareness. Some residents, particularly those born into wealth and raised in this world, seem to have experienced it as simply how life was. They didn't question the system because they'd never known anything else. They performed the social rituals because that's what one did, not because they'd made a conscious choice to participate in maintaining inequality. This unreflective acceptance was probably most common among women, who had fewer opportunities to engage with the broader world and whose lives were most completely circumscribed by social convention. But other residents were clearly more conscious of the system's arbitrariness. Men who had made their own fortunes, rather than inheriting them, often understood that wealth wasn't the same as virtue or ability. They'd competed in the business world and knew that success often came from luck, ruthlessness, or simply being in the right place at the right time, rather than from superior merit. Some of them felt ambivalent about the social world their wealth granted access to, even as they participated in it. Their letters and diaries, the ones that survive, sometimes express cynicism about society's pretensions and awareness of the gap between image and reality. And some residents actively criticize the system even while benefiting from it. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, who we discussed earlier, channeled her wealth and social position into the women's suffrage movement, explicitly arguing that the social structures that constrained elite women were unjust. Some wealthy families supported labor unions and social reform movements, understanding that the extreme inequality of the Gilded Age was unsustainable and unjust. These reformers were often ostracized by their social peers, who viewed them as traitors to their class. But they persisted, and their work eventually contributed to the progressive reforms of the early 20th century that somewhat moderated American inequality. The luxury apartment buildings themselves became less central to elite life after World War II. Several factors drove this change. First, changing tax laws made it harder to maintain the enormous household staffs that luxury apartment living had assumed. Estate taxes and income taxes reduced the ability of families to pass wealth intact across generations. Second, suburbanization drew many wealthy families out of cities entirely. After the war, the ideal of American success increasingly centered on a suburban house with a yard rather than an urban apartment. Third, cooperative ownership structures in many buildings eventually gave way to condominium arrangements that reduced collective control and community, making buildings feel more like collections of individual units than true communities. But the most exclusive buildings maintained their status and their basic character. 740 Park Avenue is still enormously desirable and selective. The Dakota still attracts famous residents. These buildings and a few others like them remain true to their original purpose, exclusive enclaves for the very wealthy in the heart of major cities. And the basic model: luxury apartments, carefully controlled access, professional management that maintains standards, has proliferated worldwide. Every major city now has its elite residential buildings where the wealthy cluster together, maintaining separation from the broader population while enjoying urban amenities. What can we learn from the history of Gilded Age luxury apartments? Perhaps most importantly, that extreme inequality requires active maintenance. It doesn't just happen naturally. It has to be constructed and defended through social mechanisms, institutional arrangements, and constant performance. The luxury apartment building was one such mechanism, brilliantly adapted to maintaining elite separation and privilege in an urban, modern context. Understanding how it worked, and how it still works, is essential to understanding how inequality persists in American society. The story of these buildings also reminds us that history isn't just about the famous events and prominent figures we learn about in school. It's also about the everyday arrangements that shaped how people lived, where they lived, how their homes were organized, who they interacted with, what their daily routines looked like. These details matter because they reveal the real texture of historical life, and because they show how large social structures like inequality actually operated in practice. And perhaps most importantly, understanding this history reminds us that the social world we take for granted, our ideas about how people should live, what arrangements are normal, what inequalities are acceptable, is not natural or inevitable. It was constructed by specific people, making specific choices for specific reasons. The Gilded Age elite created luxury apartment buildings because they needed a way to maintain their privileged position in a changing society. The buildings worked brilliantly for that purpose, so brilliantly that the model has persisted for well over a century. But it was a choice, and different choices could have created different arrangements. Recognizing this is the first step toward imagining how things could be different in the future. As we stand here today, more than a century after the first luxury apartment buildings rose in Manhattan, the tensions that created them remain unresolved. American inequality is again approaching Gilded Age levels. The wealthy again cluster in exclusive enclaves, sometimes the very same buildings their predecessors occupied. The mechanisms of social exclusivity continue to operate, now supplemented by new technologies and financial arrangements, but fundamentally unchanged. The performance of elite status continues, though the specific rituals have evolved, and most Americans remain excluded from these privileged spaces, looking up at luxury buildings they'll never enter, much as New Yorkers in the 1880s gazed at the Dakota and imagined the lives within. The difference, perhaps, is that we now understand more clearly how the system works. We can see the social mechanisms, the economic arrangements, the cultural performances that maintain inequality. We can recognize that luxury apartment buildings aren't just housing but institutions that actively create and preserve elite separation. This understanding doesn't automatically give us the power to change the system. Wealth still translates into power, and those benefiting from current arrangements have strong incentives to maintain them. But understanding is a prerequisite for change. You can't transform a system you don't comprehend. So the next time you walk past a luxury apartment building, whether a historic structure from the Gilded Age or a gleaming modern tower, take a moment to think about what's really there. It's not just expensive real estate or impressive architecture. It's a carefully constructed social world designed to maintain separation and privilege. It's the physical embodiment of inequality, beautiful and exclusive and deeply political in its very existence. The people inside aren't living some neutral, apolitical lifestyle. They're participating in a system that concentrates resources, power, and opportunity in the hands of a tiny minority while excluding everyone else. Understanding this, really understanding it, not just intellectually, but viscerally, changes how you see not just luxury buildings but the entire structure of American society. And that's what the Gilded Age can teach us. Not that rich people in the past lived differently than rich people today, though they did. Not that luxury apartments have interesting architectural features, though they do, but that inequality is constructed, that it requires constant work to maintain, and that the comfortable, beautiful, seemingly natural arrangements we see around us are actually the products of specific choices made by specific people to advance specific interests. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, you have to decide what you're going to do about it. The families who lived in those gilded apartments made their choices. They chose luxury and exclusivity and separation. They chose to maintain their privileges through whatever means necessary. They performed their roles in an elaborate social drama that preserved inequality across generations. Some did so thoughtlessly, accepting the world as they found it. Others did so consciously, defending their advantages even when they understood those advantages were unjust. A few tried to use their privilege to make change, with varying degrees of success and sincerity. We face similar choices today. We can accept current arrangements as natural and inevitable. We can participate in maintaining inequality without thinking too much about it. We can acknowledge problems while doing nothing to address them. Or we can recognize that the social world is constructed by human choices and can therefore be reconstructed through different choices. The Gilded Age elite built their luxury apartments to solve a problem: how to maintain extreme privilege in a democratic society. We could build something else entirely to solve a different problem: how to create genuine equality and shared prosperity in a modern world. It starts with understanding what we're actually looking at when we see those beautiful buildings, and it ends with deciding what kind of world we want to build instead.